Our next speaker is Thomas. He is a member of the editorial board of the Fire This Time newspaper and a pipe fitter. He will be speaking about this opening of the era of war and occupation within the other organizing Mao does. Thomas.
What happens in one country isn't just isolated to that country. It wasn't true then, and especially it isn't true now. And what's happening in Somalia and what's happening in Sudan isn't isolated to themselves, and certainly isn't isolated in the current events of the world right now. We live in a world that is defined by war and occupation, by invasion, and defined a lot by the suffering imposed on people. But there's something else coming out of this world that I think is very important, and I'm going to get to later. But I want to give the context of this era. I want to give a context that we need to look at as far as understanding why there's Sudan, why there is an invasion in Somalia. And we look at just from 2001 the international context of the war, of the era of war and occupation. 2001 was the invasion of Afghanistan. 2003 was the invasion of Iraq. 2003 was also when France went back into Côte d'Ivoire. 2004 was again the invasion and the coup in Haiti, where the US, Canada, and France and the United Nations overthrew the only democratically elected government in Haiti's history, and imposed death squads. And it's not just invasions, it was threats of invasions against countries like Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, and now Sudan a lot. And this misery and this escalation against people isn't just limited internationally. Domestically, and I guess I'll just use British Columbia and Canada as kind of a case study. Domestically, look what's happened in 2001. In 2001 in British Columbia, the Liberal government and Gordon Campbell came to power, and they ripped up employment standards. They went on a specific campaign of reducing welfare rolls. They attacked unions specifically and working people specifically. And if you want to look at the major strikes that have happened in British Columbia since 2001, they've been declared illegal by the government almost immediately. There's also an increasing move to privatize healthcare. And nationally, we have these things called security certificates, which are used to demonize and which are used to hound Arab and Muslim communities, where people are imprisoned without evidence, without trial, without end, indefinitely. And these target Muslim men specifically. So, by any standards, by any markers, there's been an escalation in misery, there's been an escalation in attacks. And I liked what Natasha did, was she was asking why. I agree a lot with what she said, is that basically I think these large countries like the US, like France, like Canada, competing against each other for resources and all these things, they ran out of room. Their need for increased profit, their need for increased resources, their need for increased hegemony has run the world out. And now they're banging and they're clashing against each other. And when there's this increased competition, they can't rely on their proxies. They can't rely on these countries, these corrupt leaders that they've paid to follow them anymore. Because if you've bought somebody, that means that person can be bought. That means the next country that comes along with more money or more resources or a better idea than what you had can buy them. And we also saw before 2001 was the rise of people, not some anti-imperialist movements, and not even specifically anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movements, just the rise of people who were fed up with their conditions. And for the United States and for Canada and for Britain, they can't gamble that that discontent, that movement will turn into something larger. They need to sever it. They need to nip it at the bud. And the United States saw, like Natasha said, increasing competition with countries like China and France. And what's the United States left as far as what's its strength, what's its strong point? It's its military. So what do? You focus on your strengths. And they put down the gauntlet, and they invaded Afghanistan, and they invaded Iraq. And they said to the rest of the world, they said to the rest of imperialists, we're doing this, what are you going to do? And they had to follow suit. And since 2003 in Iraq, over 700,000 people dead. Since 2001 in Afghanistan, tens of thousands of people dead. In Haiti, if you just look on Research Haiti, you'll see the most brutal, disgusting, despicable pictures and reports about what United Nations forces and what United Nations trained forces are doing there. Pretty bleak, pretty glim. But out of that, there's something else. And I think if the story ended there, it would be the worst story that was ever written. But there's something else. And what I think that something else has been the development of struggle of oppressed people. The development of people within these countries that have faced colonialism for centuries, that have faced imperialism, that have faced these conditions, are rising and fighting back. And if we think the world is bad today, if we think that Iraq is bad today, if we think the Middle East is horrible today, well then imagine if after May 1st, 2003, when George Bush declared mission accomplished in Iraq, if the United States had been able to impose its strategy, if within a couple months it had secured Iraq and was moving on to Iran, moving on to Syria, moving on to North Korea, imagine if the United States had been able to do what they wanted to do, what they were sure they were going to be able to do in Iraq. Imagine what the world would look like today if Canada had been able to secure Afghanistan, if it wasn't just Kabul that they had locked down like a prison. Imagine if Israel had been successful this summer in their invasion of Lebanon, if they were still there, if they were controlling that country. Imagine all the new poems we would have had. Imagine if there was no Palestinian resistance 59 years later after the start of the occupation. Imagine if keffiyehs weren't worn around the world as an important symbol of struggle, an important symbol of people fighting for change. And Israel can deny all it wants the election of Hamas. Canada can deny all it wants the democratically elected government of Hamas, but they can't deny what that represents. It represents the will of the people that keep fighting against occupation. They voted for the only party specifically against occupation, specifically against the state of Israel. And they can't deny that fire still burns inside people of Palestine. Imagine if there was no signs of grassroots movements in Haiti where people are fighting even though they know if they go to jail, 96% of them, and this is according to the International Crisis Group and quoted in The Economist magazine, if 96% of them don't get tried, they put you in there and they let you rot, but people still fight. And look at that, $661 billion, it's like they just threw it in the hole because they can't secure Iraq because people in Iraq are fighting against them, and people in Afghanistan are fighting against them, and people in Lebanon are fighting against them, and people in Haiti are fighting against them, and people in Somalia are fighting against them, and people in Sudan are fighting against them, and people around the world are fighting against them. Thank you.